Welcome back to Sleepy Mythologies. If you're new here, we explore the ancient world gently, with soft storytelling, quiet truths, and long-forgotten rituals. If you enjoy calming history and immersive tales from the past, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories still to come. Now, take a breath, and let's begin. Before the cries, before the hammer strikes, before the long shadow of a crucified figure fell upon the earth, there was silence. In the Roman world, justice was not always swift, but it was always visible. It lived in the streets, in the squares, in the eyes of the condemned, and the watchful gaze of the crowd. For the Romans, punishment was not only about retribution, it was about spectacle and order. Pain and shame weren't merely consequences. They were tools. Tools for control, for ceremony, for a strange and quiet kind of theater. This is the story of Roman punishment, not just the cross itself, but the long, methodical descent toward it. A descent paved with rituals, laws, public performances, and expectations. And in the heart of it all, a question. How does a society use pain to define itself? And what happens when death becomes a message? Settle in, breathe deeply, and walk with me into a world of strange justice, cold, calculated, and hauntingly human. Imagine a city where law lived in stone, carved into bronze tablets, etched into marble, and echoed in the voices of magistrates. The city was Rome, the heart of an empire, and it pulsed not only with power, but with a deep, deliberate rhythm of order. In Rome, law wasn't just enforced, it was performed. To the Romans, justice was about harmony, a balance of power, class, honor, and reputation. And when that balance was broken, by theft, rebellion, murder, or shameful behavior, it had to be restored visibly, publicly, painfully. The earliest legal codes, like the 12 Tables, laid the groundwork for this performance. They established not only what crimes were, but how to punish them in a way that reinforced Roman values: honor, discipline, obedience. The act of punishment, whether mild or fatal, had to fit the role of the offender. A citizen might receive fines or exile. A slave, however, might face branding or execution. Status mattered. Appearance mattered. The punishment wasn't just for the guilty. It was for the onlookers. Rome's legal language reflected this deeply theatrical nature. Damnatio, condemnation; flagellatio, flogging; fustuarium, clubbing to death, often in military contexts. Each word was both a sentence and a ritual. Take the fustuarium as an example. In the Roman army, discipline was sacred. If a soldier deserted his post, stole from comrades, or fell asleep on guard duty, his punishment wasn't quiet or private. He would be surrounded by his fellow soldiers, each one given a cudgel or club, and together they would beat him to death. It wasn't just execution, it was purification. The act erased the shame and reinforced collective loyalty. Silence followed the beating, but that silence was heavy. It reminded every watcher what was expected and what would come of betrayal. In civilian life, punishment ranged from harsh fines and property seizure to corporal acts. Public beatings were common, as were parades of the condemned through the forum. The humiliation wasn't incidental, it was integral. And then there were the public executions. Rome rarely hid its justice. In fact, it built entire structures for it: arenas, scaffolds, temples of judgment. Here, the criminal met not just death, but the gaze of Rome, and that gaze was everything. Because to the Romans, punishment was memory, a collective memory, one that lingered long after the act. Before wood was raised, before nails were driven, before the agonies of crucifixion began, there was the lash. In the Roman world, scourging, or flagellation, was not a mere prelude. It was a ritual in itself, a deeply symbolic and often brutal ceremony that served to mark the condemned body, to weaken it, and to strip away identity before the final execution. To be scourged was to be prepared. Let's begin in the shade of a Roman prison cell. The condemned waits. His sentence has been read. Crucifixion. But before he is paraded through the streets or raised upon the cross, he must pass through the hands of the lictors, Rome's ceremonial enforcers. They are more than guards. They are the keepers of the state's instruments, the fasces, and the scourge. The scourge, or flagrum, was no simple whip. It often had multiple thongs, sometimes weighted with bits of lead, bone, or bronze. These were not added for pain alone, though pain was central. They were there to break the skin, to tear the flesh, to erase the boundary between man and punishment. Scourging was rarely done in haste. Like all Roman ceremonies, it had a rhythm. The lictors did not scream. The condemned, however, often did. But it was not his screams that mattered. It was the image, the sight of flesh laid open, of muscle shivering beneath blood, of a body slowly transforming from person to penalty. The lash fell again and again, often in public view, sometimes in the praetor's court, sometimes in the forum or before a temple. The precise location varied, but the purpose never did. This was not about cleansing the soul. It was about marking the body. Roman citizens were, in theory, exempt from scourging unless sentenced for treason or stripped of citizenship. Slaves, rebels, and foreigners were not so protected. Their backs were the canvas of the state, their suffering a silent decree. But even among citizens, the line could blur. In times of war or under particularly cruel magistrates, legal protections dissolved like dew in the heat. The flagellatio also served another function. It weakened the body. The Romans were keen observers of death. They knew that crucifixion could take days. Scourging, by design, shortened that span. It hastened collapse. It robbed the victim of breath, of strength, of resistance. But more than that, it robbed him of self. After scourging, the condemned was often paraded with the crossbeam, the patibulum, lashed to his shoulders. This burden, combined with the wounds of the lash, made every step a public unraveling. The body staggered, trembled, bled. The people watched. And in that watching, they learned what defiance cost. In some cases, scourging was the punishment itself. A man might be sentenced to 100 lashes or more. Few survived such a count. Those who did carried the sentence in their flesh for life. It is easy, from our modern distance, to imagine this as simple brutality. But to the Romans, it was order, a kind of music. Each stroke of the lash was a note in the song of control. And beneath that music, always, was the silence of acceptance. The condemned rarely pleaded, not because they were brave, though some were, but because they knew that the law had already spoken. The scourge was just its echo. So before the cross came the lash. Before the nails, the bleeding. Before the silence of death. The long, methodical chorus of pain. Before the body was broken, the spirit was humbled. Rome knew that pain alone could not keep order. Shame was its companion. And in the long road to the cross, humiliation was a required step. In the Republic and beyond, shame was not a private feeling, it was a public tool. A moral mirror held to the face of the accused, and few things reflected more clearly than the rituals of degradation that preceded an execution. The condemned, already scourged and weakened, was now dressed in mockery. Depending on the crime, he might wear a crown of thorns, a robe, or an animal's skin. The idea was not just to mark him as guilty, but to strip away identity, to turn a man into a symbol and a warning. The Romans called this the pompa poenae, the punishment procession. It wasn't just about getting the criminal to the site of death. It was theater, a final act, and everyone was meant to watch. The procession passed through crowded streets, markets, temples, forums. The condemned carried the crossbeam, sometimes dragged it, as insults and stones flew from the crowd. Children watched. Merchants paused. Magistrates observed from shaded balconies. The city became a stage. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was pedagogy. Rome believed that watching the shamed body would deter future crimes, that public degradation would inoculate the people against rebellion. At the heart of it all was the loss of dignity. A Roman citizen valued dignitas, a sense of worth, of legacy, of honor. The rituals before execution were designed to dissolve it, to make the individual vanish and the crime stand in his place. Sometimes signs were hung around the neck. Tituli, they were called. They bore the name and crime of the condemned. Thief, blasphemer, traitor. The public didn't need the full story, just the headline, just enough to remember. And when they remembered the shame, not the man. The condemned often fell during this procession, whether from weakness or from stone-paved roads made cruel by time. The guards would not help him up gently. They would beat, goad, push. This, too, was part of the ritual. There was silence here, too, not just from the crowd, but from the condemned. Rarely did he speak. What was there to say? He was no longer a citizen. He was no longer even a man. He was an example. And as the crowd watched, they were meant to internalize the lesson. Honor Rome. Obey the law, or become like him. Next came the ascent, to the hill, to the gate, to the place of crucifixion. But that's for another chapter. For now, remember this. Before the death came the disgrace. And that, for the Romans, was the true beginning of justice. The hill rose slowly. Not high, but high enough to be seen. High enough to become memory. The Romans chose their crucifixion sites carefully, sometimes near roads, sometimes outside city gates, always where the most eyes could see. Because the cross was not just a tool of execution, it was a billboard, a final warning, a frozen scream. The crucifixion itself was not a singular act. It was a series of degradations, each one precise, deliberate. The condemned arrived already scourged, already humiliated, already half-broken. What followed was a slow disassembly of the body and of identity. First came the patibulum, the crossbeam, carried from the place of scourging. Heavy, splintered, tied to the shoulders or arms. The upright post, the stipes, was often already in place, sunk into the earth like a marker of death. At the foot of the cross, the condemned was stripped. If any clothing remained, it was removed now. Nakedness in Roman culture was shameful, particularly for citizens. Stripping the body stripped it of dignity. Then came the nails, or in some cases, ropes. Contrary to popular image, not all crucifixions used nails. Some victims were bound. But the most brutal form, the one reserved for rebels, slaves, and the most hated, used iron spikes. The nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms. The hands could not support the weight. And through the feet or ankles, pinned to the stipes. The process was noisy. Screams, hammer blows, the rasp of breathing. But after the noise came silence. A long, terrible silence. The crucified did not die quickly. That was the point. Death might take hours, days. The body sagged, the lungs compressed, breathing became labor. Every inhale demanded a pull upward, scraping torn flesh against rough wood. The cycle repeated, until it didn't. Birds gathered, flies came. Passers-by stared or jeered. Some pitied, most did not. And above the victim's head, a titulus, a sign bearing the crime. Not the name, not the story, just the offense. Thief, murderer, traitor. Sometimes families watched. Sometimes they didn't know. Sometimes they begged to take the body. But crucifixion carried a stigma that lingered even in death. It was meant to be final, to destroy not just the body, but the legacy. The Romans used crucifixion to send a message. This is what defiance looks like. This is what rebellion costs. And the message worked. It terrified. It silenced. It endured. Even centuries later, long after crucifixion was outlawed, its image haunted memory. A cross, a man, a sky darkening with clouds. In the end, the Romans were right about one thing. Pain speaks, and death, when used correctly, never stops talking. But this is not the end of the story. There is one more chapter. Because what the Romans didn't intend was for the cross to be remembered not as a tool of fear, but as a symbol of transformation. The Romans never imagined the story would end this way. The cross, once a marker of shame, would become something else. Something sacred, revered, worn around necks, placed atop churches, etched into tombstones, and whispered in prayers. This chapter is not about the act of crucifixion. It's about what came after, what lingered, what grew. Because even as Rome's empire faded, the shadow of the cross only lengthened. To the Roman mind, crucifixion was the lowest point of human degradation. It was the penalty for the worst, for those without honor, without name, without a place in memory. It was designed to erase. But memory is a strange thing. In the 1st century, small groups of people, Jews, Greeks, freedmen, slaves, began gathering in hidden spaces, catacombs, courtyards, rooms above shops. They spoke of a man who had been crucified, a man whose execution had not erased him, but enshrined him. They spoke of resurrection. They called him Christos. And slowly, what had once been a curse became a creed. In those early centuries, the cross was not yet a public emblem. Christians feared persecution, and with good reason. Crucifixion was still fresh, still terrifying. Instead of crosses, they painted fish, anchors, shepherds. But the cross was always there, whispered, remembered. By the 3rd century, crosses began to appear in art, carved into sarcophagi, hidden in mosaics, sometimes stylized, a disguised T, a tree, a pattern of stars. The shame hadn't disappeared, but now it was woven with meaning. In embracing the cross, early Christians were making a radical claim that suffering could be sacred, that death was not the end, that Rome's greatest weapon had failed to silence its greatest message. Then came Constantine. the first Christian emperor, the man who saw a vision before battle, a cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. He won, and the world changed. Christianity became legal, then favored, then dominant, and with it, the cross transformed, from a symbol hidden in fear to one raised in triumph. The iron spikes were still there, the blood was still remembered, but now it was holy blood, a holy tree, a paradox, a torture device reborn as a ladder to heaven. The cross began to crown kings and seal documents. It adorned churches, jewels, and battle standards. It entered language and law. It became a sign of power, but also a reminder that power itself must be carried with humility. The image of the crucified Christ appeared everywhere, not in shame, but in glory, not in silence, but in song. And yet, the pain never disappeared. It was never meant to. It was transfigured. Why does the cross endure? Why do we still wear it, revere it, fear it? Maybe because it captures something elemental, something deeply human. The cross is both brutal and beautiful. It reminds us that power is never absolute, that even the mightiest empire cannot predict how its tools will be remembered. Rome intended the cross to silence. Instead, it became a voice, a declaration of hope in despair, of life in death, of meaning in suffering. This is not a defense of crucifixion. It is not an erasure of pain. It is an acknowledgement that memory is shaped not only by power, but by what comes after, by who remembers, and how. Look around. Even now, centuries later, the cross is everywhere, not just in churches, but in literature, in art, in dreams. It crosses languages, borders, beliefs. For some, it is sacred. For others, strange. For all, it is undeniable. A single vertical line, a single horizontal beam, the geometry of grief, and the architecture of hope. Rome could break a body, but it could not break the idea that the body mattered, that pain was real, that justice could be challenged, that death might not be the end. The cross may be Rome's most haunting legacy, but it wasn't the only one. The structures of justice, control, and public punishment the Romans crafted rippled forward through time, echoing in dungeons, gallows, stocks, and even modern prisons. In medieval Europe, the Roman example loomed large. Executions were still public, still theatrical, still meant to convey power, drawn and quartered, burned at the stake, stretched on the rack. These were punishments not just for crime, but for identity, for heresy, witchcraft, rebellion, and like crucifixion, they were meant to strip the person of dignity and memory. The scaffold became the new Golgotha, the axe, the new cross. And yet, the Christian world that inherited Rome's machinery of justice was also shaped by its greatest contradiction, that the most revered figure had once been crucified. This paradox created strange tensions. Saints were martyred in Roman-like fashion. Suffering became a path to salvation. The cross, the instrument of execution, was now embraced as holy. In time, new forms of punishment replaced the cross, but the idea that pain could teach, could cleanse, could define, never disappeared. Even today, echoes remain. In the way we view justice, in the design of our prisons, in debates over public shaming and capital punishment, the body remains a battleground, a canvas for the messages of the state. And the cross, stripped of its blood and nails, still hovers over our collective memory, a reminder of how power is performed, how suffering is framed, how legacy is shaped. Rome may be gone, but its message, carved into wood, into stone, into culture, continues to whisper, even now. Buried alive. The chilling punishment of Vestal virgins. In the quiet heart of ancient Rome, where temples cast long shadows across marble streets, lived 6 women sworn to a sacred fire. They were not queens, not warriors, but their presence upheld the very soul of the Roman state. They were the Vestal virgins, and for over 1,000 years, they carried a terrifying burden. If they failed in their vow of chastity, they would not die by sword nor by flame. Instead, they would be buried alive. This is their story, a story of purity, power, and quiet terror. To the Romans, fire was not just heat or light. It was life, spirit, the living breath of the gods. And at the Temple of Vesta, that flame never went out. Tended day and night by the Vestal virgins, the fire symbolized Rome's eternity. If it died, it was believed the city itself would falter. This flame, held in the sacred hearth, was more than symbolic. It was treated as a living entity, one that needed constant attention, care, and reverence. It connected Rome's past to its present and promised a future as long as the flame endured. Chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, these girls were taken from noble families, plucked from childhood, sworn into 30 years of sacred duty. The selection process was rigorous and ceremonial. Fathers of eligible girls considered it an honor, though it also meant giving up their daughters to a life not quite their own. The chosen girl would leave her family and enter the house of the Vestals, a tranquil compound near the Roman Forum, nestled among marble colonnades and sacred groves. Her life was instantly transformed. She wore a distinctive white robe and headdress. Her hair was styled in the traditional senicrines, a ritual hairstyle symbolizing her virginity and role. These girls became women under the gaze of gods rather than kin. Their 30-year service was divided into 3 stages: 10 years of learning the sacred rites, 10 years of performing them, and 10 years of training the new initiates. Their days were filled with ritual. They guarded sacred relics, tended to the flame, participated in public festivals, and even held legal privileges rare for Roman women. They could manage their own property, make a will, and were often entrusted with state secrets and rituals. In return for these freedoms and honors, they carried an invisible yoke. Chastity was not simply a rule. It was a metaphysical bond. It linked their personal purity to the well-being of Rome itself. The virginity of a Vestal was not about morality. It was about cosmic balance. The city's safety, fertility, and fortune were believed to depend on it. And should they break that vow, Rome would make no exceptions. No matter how noble her birth, no matter how long she had served, a Vestal found guilty of unchastity would face a punishment so rare, so sacred, that it could only be performed with religious precision and with haunting quietude. When whispers began, when rumors of broken vows reached the ears of Rome's elite, an investigation would follow, not by priests, not by generals, but by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, the bridge between the mortal and divine. The accusation itself was not taken lightly. A Vestal's reputation was sacred. So when a charge of unchastity arose, it meant something had already fractured deeply within the political or religious strata. Sometimes the accusation was a weapon, an act of vengeance, manipulation, or scapegoating. But once it was made, it had to be answered. The trial, if it can be called that, was not a public affair. The Vestal was not granted advocates. The Pontifex and his council acted as judges, witnesses, and jury. They were not searching for guilt in a modern legal sense. They were searching for signs, omens, inconsistencies, divine signals. If the Pontifex deemed the Vestal guilty, there could be no turning back. Yet Roman law forbade the execution of a Vestal by any standard means. Her blood was sacred. She had served the gods. To harm her bodily would be to defile Rome itself. So the punishment took another form, a silent, symbolic act of returning her to the earth, alive, unharmed by blade, unspilled in blood. Burial, a haunting compromise between justice and taboo. The condemned was considered already dead in spirit. And yet, she breathed. Her name would be removed from records, her family disgraced. The man accused of violating her, whether a willing partner or scapegoat, would be executed, beaten to death with rods. No ceremony, no mercy. And so, even before she was laid beneath the soil, the world began to forget her. Once the sentence was delivered, the entire city knew what was coming, and yet no one spoke openly of it. Rome was a city that celebrated conquest, paraded captives, and glorified blood sport in its arenas. But this, the execution of a Vestal, was never entertainment. It was a ritual, a lament. The condemned woman was prepared in silence. She was dressed in the same white garments she wore during her duties, a ghostly echo of her former life. Her veil was drawn over her head, and she was adorned not like a prisoner, but like a bride. To the gods, perhaps, or to the grave. The procession began at dusk. Flanked by lictors and priests, the Pontifex Maximus walked at her side. Musicians did not play. No hymns were sung. The people gathered in the streets said nothing. It was not mourning, and it was not spectacle. It was reverence for the divine, and fear. They walked beyond the city gates to a place known only for this purpose, the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked, a patch of land cursed by association, avoided by locals, left untouched by farmers. It was said nothing grew there. A narrow stairwell had been prepared. It led into a subterranean chamber, deep enough to bury the body, but not so deep as to seem like a tomb. Inside was a bed, a single oil lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a small container of milk. Enough for a day or two, just enough to maintain the illusion that she was not being murdered outright. The Pontifex Maximus, according to the ritual texts, would offer prayers. Some sources suggest he would comfort her. Others say he would avoid looking her in the eyes. Perhaps each priest did it differently. Perhaps some saw her as guilty, others as a martyr. She would descend the steps on her own. No force, no binding. And then the entrance was sealed. First with wooden planks, then bricks, and finally with a mound of earth. Above the freshly covered mound, priests would make one final offering to Vesta, a plea that the goddess accept the sacrifice and spare the city from punishment. The silence that followed was thick. The people dispersed quietly. The field of the wicked would remain untouched. No marker, no inscription. The city turned its gaze back to its rituals, its markets, its military triumphs. But beneath the earth, a woman remained, and the flame she once tended burned on. For the Romans, honor was everything. Glory might come from the battlefield, but integrity moral, religious, and familial, was preserved in how one upheld the unspoken codes of the state. A Vestal virgin who broke her vows didn't just shame herself, she brought a dark shadow over Rome's sacred institutions. Though she descended into the earth in silence, her fall echoed loudly among patrician households, priesthoods, and public discourse. The public didn't speak her name, but they watched. They remembered. In the Senate, questions might be whispered about signs and omens. Had this breach of chastity foretold military disaster, a failed harvest, political collapse? Because the Vestals embodied Rome's stability, any impurity within them was treated as cosmic infection. The shame was metaphysical, lingering not just over the woman herself, but over those who raised her, those who selected her, and those who failed to prevent the breach. Her family bore the brunt of the disgrace. Some were exiled from the city. Others were stripped of political privilege. In certain cases, familial wealth was confiscated. Her father, if alive, often disappeared from public life, haunted, dishonored, silent. In the house of the Vestals, the atmosphere would darken. The remaining sisters lived and served under a quiet fog of collective guilt, their trust in one another shaken, their rituals weighted with tension. It was said that in the wake of a buried sister, the flame of Vesta flickered unnaturally, nervous, uncertain. But the shame also lived among the commoners. People whispered about why she failed. Had she been seduced? Coerced? Was it truly her crime? Or had politics forced a scapegoat to silence a scandal? In Roman superstition, dreams of the buried woman were treated as bad omens. Some households would avoid speaking her name aloud for years after the sentence. Others left small offerings near crossroads, hoping to appease the wandering spirit of a Vestal wronged. The site of her execution, the Campus Sceleratus, was never reclaimed. No monuments, no inscriptions. Generations knew what had happened there, yet its purpose remained half-spoken, taught with raised brows and lowered voices. Perhaps what made the punishment most haunting was its contradiction. Rome gave the Vestals honor beyond compare, yet placed them under the weight of a cruelty no other citizen would face. They could speak freely in courts, ride in carriages, and wield religious power. But the moment they faltered, their death became a sacred spectacle, one the public both feared and condoned. In truth, shame in Rome was as much about control as about morality. The punishment of the Vestals reinforced that not even the most sacred were above the expectations of the state, and in punishing them so severely, Rome reminded itself and its people that order would be maintained, even if that meant sacrificing its own ideals. Time moved on. The empire grew, changed, and eventually crumbled. But the story of the Vestals and the punishment they sometimes suffered lingered in the collective imagination. Rome became Christian. Temples were repurposed or abandoned. Fires once kept in sacred hearths were extinguished in favor of new altars. The rituals of old gods gave way to the rites of the new faith. And yet, the Vestal legacy endured, not always clearly, but like a shadow in architecture, in law, and in storytelling. Medieval writers spoke of the Vestals with awe and superstition. Christian scholars cited their strict moral codes, sometimes admiring their discipline, sometimes condemning their pagan purity. Even in a new religious era, the notion of sacred chastity and ritual service endured, repackaged for convents and cloisters. In art and poetry, the image of the buried virgin became a symbol of innocence punished, of devotion taken too far, of women caught in systems far older than themselves. Painfully, she also became a metaphor, invoked when society struggled with the cost of keeping sacred vows in an unyielding world. Roman historians preserved the names of a few women who were executed, or believed to be: Cornelia, Licinia, Emilia. Their stories blend fact with folklore. Their tombs are unknown, their bodies lost, but their memories linger in dusty manuscripts and broken marble. And perhaps that's the most haunting legacy. The Vestals were chosen as children, raised to be sacred, elevated and isolated, loved and feared, and yet, with a single mistake or accusation, they were cast into silence, buried not just in earth, but in time. And now, here we are, centuries later, remembering them again. In the end, their punishment wasn't just about crime. It was about control, about reminding everyone, sacred or not, that Rome watched. And when Rome judged, it did so with finality. But for us, perhaps the lesson is gentler. That even in systems of great power, we must listen for the quiet voices, the ones lost, buried, misremembered, because even the stillest flame leaves a trace. Sleep well, and thank you for remembering with me. Chapter 3: The Theater of Pain. Before the grandeur of triumphal arches and marble forums, before the measured speech of senators and the cadence of poets, there was something else, something darker, something silent, yet echoing. A crowd gathers, not for a play, not for a speech, but for a man chained to a post, a woman bound beneath the midday sun, a criminal who has become a lesson. Because in Rome, punishment was never hidden. It was public, it was ritual, and it was spectacle. The Roman world was built on rules, sacred laws that governed not only the conduct of citizens, but the very boundaries of life and death. Those who violated these rules didn't just face imprisonment or a fine. No, they were made into stories, into symbols, into examples. Tonight, we walk slowly through that world, a world where justice was tied to pain, where law and punishment were theatrical, where torment had purpose, not only in inflicting suffering, but in defining civilization itself. This is not a tale of cruelty for cruelty's sake. It is a meditation on control, on order, on a society that believed pain could build peace. So settle in, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift into a forgotten dimension of the Roman Empire. One paved not in marble, but in scars. The wheel and the stake, crimes against the gods. To understand the punishments of the Roman world, we must begin not with theft or treason, but with blasphemy. Rome was not just a city of men. It was a city of gods. The divine lived in its temples, its household hearths, its crossroads. Religion was not merely personal belief. It was civic duty, a contract between mortals and the divine. So to break that contract was to unmake Rome. And the punishment? It had to match the cosmic scale of the crime: sacrilege and the sacral order. Sacrilege, the theft of temple treasures, the desecration of sacred groves, the breaking of holy oaths, was not treated lightly. The person who stole a golden chalice from the temple of Jupiter didn't just rob a god. They endangered the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Without divine favor, Rome faltered. Crops failed. Storms raged. Enemies advanced. So when sacrilege occurred, the punishment was not only for justice, it was for purification. The wheel, a body broken for the sky. One of the most chilling punishments recorded for serious sacrilege or murder was binding to the wheel, a large wooden apparatus, often horizontal, where the condemned would be strapped down and subjected to a slow, public death. In some cases, bones were broken systematically, a limb at a time. In others, the criminal was simply left exposed to the sun, the wind, and the birds. The goal was not always immediate death. It was display. A broken body, a broken oath. The people would pass. They would whisper. They would remember. And the gods would be appeased. The stake, a sentence to the earth. For some, especially women accused of violating sacred vows, the punishment took a different shape: burial alive. Most famously, this fate befell the Vestal virgins who broke their vow of chastity. But the act of burying someone alive, often in a small, sealed underground chamber, was also used in cases of incest, treason against the gods, or abominable acts thought to defile the sacred. The symbolism was clear. The criminal was removed from the world of the living without bloodshed, sent beneath the earth, where the chthonic gods could deal with them directly. There was silence, darkness, time, and then nothing. Sacred pain and civic cleansing. These punishments may seem excessive, even horrific, but they weren't born of sadism. They were rituals. Pain was part of purification, a way to balance the scales when the divine contract had been broken. To strike against the gods was to threaten the very soul of the Republic, and so the punishment had to speak back, not just to the criminal, but to the community, to remind them that the divine watched and waited. This was Rome's earliest and most primal fear, that the gods might turn away. And so, with wheels and stakes and silent tombs, they made their offerings, not with incense, but with flesh. In the Roman world, not all punishments aimed to kill. Some were designed to last a lifetime, written not on parchment, but into the body. Branding and tattooing, words made flesh. To be branded in ancient Rome was not just a physical pain, it was a public announcement. Slaves who tried to escape were often marked on the forehead with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, fugitive. Criminals caught thieving or cheating the state might be branded with symbols or phrases that mark them as dishonest, dangerous, or disloyal. The forehead was a favorite place for this, chosen not because it was easy, but because it was visible. There was no hiding a brand burned into the skin above your eyes. In time, Rome even adopted forms of tattooing, though not for beauty. Roman soldiers who deserted were sometimes inked with humiliating marks. Rebels branded with the names of the emperors they had defied. In this way, the body became a living sentence, cutting and maiming. The sentence in flesh. Mutilation had long been a tool of state punishment. A thief might lose a hand, a liar, a tongue. In Rome, such punishments were often used for crimes that struck at the moral fabric of society. Adulterers might be disfigured, rapists castrated, slaves punished by the cutting of an ear or the splitting of a nose. These acts were not only punishments, they were warnings. When a person walked through the marketplace with a scarred face or a missing hand, the message was clear. This person broke the rules. This is what happens. Humiliation as sentence. Not all torment was physical. Romans also used humiliation as punishment. A man caught in theft might be paraded naked through the city. A corrupt official might have his clothing stripped and be forced to wear a dunce-like cap or carry weights. The goal was public shame. For the Romans, honor was everything. To be mocked, exposed, or degraded in front of your peers could sometimes feel worse than death. And so, the magistrates used that tool, again and again, to brand the guilty in spirit as well as body. Who was mutilated? One must always remember, punishment in Rome was never equal. The same crime could carry vastly different consequences depending on who committed it. A senator's son might face exile. A slave for the same crime? Mutilation. The law's edge was sharpest against the poor. But this too was part of the Roman system, a visible order, reinforced through visible suffering. Every scar, every brand, every missing limb was a footnote in the empire's vast and painful ledger. In this way, justice did not need to speak. It walked, it limped, it bled, and in doing so, reminded all who saw it that Rome was watching. Execution in ancient Rome was not a secret matter handled behind closed doors. It was a ritual, a performance, a message inscribed in flesh, delivered to a watching world. These public displays were not simply about ending a life. They were about reinforcing a moral code, and more than that, reaffirming Rome's order. The city was built on law, and law, they believed, must be seen to be enforced. The arena as tribunal. To begin, we must consider the most famous and most theatrical of Rome's spaces, the arena. The Colosseum is what we remember today, but long before its construction, public spectacles were held in temporary wooden amphitheaters, in forums, and in provincial towns. Gladiatorial games, beast hunts, and executions often shared the same stage. In the morning came the animals. At noon, the executions. Known as meridiani, these midday executions were scheduled between the sporting events, sometimes treated as a sort of grim intermission. Condemned criminals, often referred to as noxi, were brought out to die in front of the crowds. Their crimes had already been judged. What remained was the sentence, a sentence carried out before thousands. Types of theatrical deaths. Execution came in many forms, each chosen with care to reflect the nature of the crime. Crucifixion, for slaves, rebels, and the lowest classes. Crucifixion was reserved for those whose crimes were seen as challenges to authority. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, involved tying the criminal to a stake, while lions, leopards, or bears were released upon them. This was not merely killing, it was unmaking, limb by limb. Burning, used for arsonists or those who had committed acts deemed impure. Fire cleansed. Beheading, a quicker, cleaner death, often reserved for Roman citizens or soldiers. These were not quiet affairs. They were spectacles designed to teach. And the lesson was always the same. Disobey Rome, and this is your fate. The mythical scripts. In some cases, executions were staged as historical or mythological dramas. Criminals were dressed as characters from myth. A man portraying Icarus might be sent down a wooden ramp, flying to his death. A criminal cast as Hercules might be burned alive to mirror the hero's fiery end. The symbolism was heavy, deliberate. The audience was not merely watching a death. They were witnessing a story, a parable of justice, crowds and catharsis. What did the crowd feel? Some wept, some cheered, most watched. In these moments, Roman citizens did not see themselves reflected in the condemned. They saw the power of the state, the endurance of law, the affirmation that justice, however brutal, prevailed. It is easy, centuries later, to recoil in horror. But for Rome, the theater of death was a civic rite, an offering to the gods, to order, and to memory. To witness an execution was not to indulge in cruelty. It was to participate in the machinery of society, the cost of spectacle. But all theater has a cost. Over time, the line between justice and entertainment blurred. Crowds demanded novelty, more animals, stranger deaths, more elaborate performances. And so, justice evolved. It bent to spectacle. It adapted to audience. In the end, what began as a tool of law became something else. A mirror. And in that mirror, Rome saw its own contradictions, the order it worshipped, and the blood it spilled to preserve it. Not all Roman executions unfolded on the blood-soaked sands of the amphitheater. Some were quieter, more ancient, more symbolic. Punishments that came not from entertainment, but from ritual, from fear, from the need to restore balance where the scales had been violently tipped. These punishments were rare, reserved, and deeply disturbing. The fire, a purifying death. Fire was more than destruction in the Roman imagination. It was purity, the domain of Vesta, of Vulcan. To burn was to cleanse. Arsonists, those who defied Rome's sacred order by setting flame to homes, temples, or public buildings, were seen as deeply corrupt. To burn a city was to unmake civilization itself. The punishment? Often, it matched the crime. In some cases, the condemned would be tied to a wooden stake in the public square. The executioners would not rush. They would prepare the pyre slowly, almost ceremonially, stacking dry kindling and oil-soaked rags beneath the victim's feet. Sometimes the fire was lit low, allowing the flames to crawl up the body, consuming it slowly. The crowd would gather not in silence, but in heavy stillness, the smell of burning flesh mingling with incense, prayers, and the murmurs of those watching. Fire erased, but it also sent a message. Let no one light a flame against Rome again. Burial alive. Silence and suffocation. Few punishments struck fear into the Roman heart like being buried alive. To be placed beneath the earth, sealed in darkness, left with only breath. And then, not even that. This was the fate of the Vestal Virgin who broke her vow. This was the fate of certain traitors, incestuous criminals, and those whose crimes were thought too polluting to shed blood. Why no blood? Because some acts were seen as so impure that spilling the criminal's blood would defile the land. Instead, a chamber would be dug, a small room underground, often with only a small amount of food and water. The condemned would be lowered in, sometimes gently. The lid would be placed. And then, it was over. The earth would take them, slowly, silently, entirely. Burial was not meant to be seen. It was meant to be remembered. Crushing, the weight of judgment. There were moments, though rare, when Rome turned to the most brutal form of all, crushing. This punishment, sometimes used for those who refused to confess or who stood silent before the court, involved laying the condemned beneath heavy boards or stones. Weight was added gradually. A stone, then another, until lungs collapsed, bones snapped, silence broke into something final. It was used sparingly, but it carried immense symbolic weight. Justice in these moments did not speak. It pressed until resistance crumbled, until truth or death emerged. Echoes of ritual and fear. What ties these punishments together is not their spectacle, but their symbolism. Fire purified, earth consumed, stone silenced. Each of these punishments came from an ancient part of the Roman soul, a part that believed the world could only function if every offense was balanced, if every disruption was met with restoration. Pain was not always the point. Sometimes it was the silence after that mattered. So, when Rome buried, burned, or crushed, it did so not just to punish, but to restore. To speak through death, a single message. The order remains. The gods are watching, and justice, however dark, is done. When the law grew teeth in ancient Rome, it often borrowed them from the animals. To understand Roman punishment fully, we must step into the arena, not for glory, but for disgrace, not as warriors, but as the condemned. And beside us, not soldiers or executioners, but beasts, lions, bears, leopards, and dogs, each one transformed from creature to executioner in the eyes of the crowd. Because in Rome, animals weren't just hunted. They were unleashed. They were justice in flesh and fang. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This punishment, literally condemnation to the beasts, was not metaphorical. It was an official sentence. Criminals, prisoners of war, and those who committed especially reviled offenses were sometimes stripped naked, bound, and cast into an arena with wild animals. The result was not simply death. It was dismemberment, terror, spectacle. The Colosseum roared not just for gladiators, but for justice made flesh. For the crowd, the sight of man versus beast was mesmerizing and instructive. It reminded them of the order of things, the fragility of lawbreakers, the power of Rome, and perhaps, most importantly, it turned punishment into performance. But not all beastly sentences were grand and theatrical. Some were intimate, surreal, even mythic. Poena culae, the sack of horror. One of the strangest punishments in Roman law was reserved for one of its most reviled crimes: parricide, the murder of one's own father. The crime violated not only the household, but the cosmic order of pietas, the sacred duty owed to one's family and ancestors. And so, the sentence had to reflect the unnaturalness of the act. It had to feel wrong. The condemned was sewn into a large leather sack, but not alone. Inside the sack, with the murderer, were animals. Traditionally, a dog, for its association with loyalty betrayed, a rooster for vigilance ignored, a monkey for distorted humanity, and a viper for lethal treachery. The symbolism was layered and eerie. Each animal was chosen carefully, reflecting aspects of the parricide's guilt. Once sealed in the sack, the criminal and creatures were cast into the Tiber, their screams muffled, their fates joined, drowned not as individuals, but as a tangle of betrayal. The Romans believed that such a crime could not be purified by blood alone. It had to be erased, drowned, swallowed by the river, as if the crime had never existed. Poena culae was not a common sentence, but its infamy lived on, passed from law texts to imagination, a symbol of how far Rome would go to punish the unthinkable. animals as mirrors of the soul. Why animals? Why not a blade, or fire, or exile? Because the Romans understood what modern minds often forget. Symbols matter. Animals were not just beasts. They were metaphors, moral tools, psychological reflections. A lion devouring a criminal showed nature's judgment. A wild dog tearing flesh was a warning of chaos unleashed. A rooster crowing as a man died reminded the audience of warnings unheeded. And a snake, always a snake, whispered of betrayal, lies, and silent death. In this way, the use of animals became its own language, one spoken not in words, but in teeth and terror, bestial justice and class. Not all criminals faced the teeth. Much like Rome's other punishments, damnatio ad bestias and poena culae were often reserved for lower classes, slaves, and foreigners. A wealthy patrician who committed parricide might be quietly exiled, or allowed to fall on his sword. But a slave who stole from his master, he might meet the lion. This imbalance was not accidental. It was built into the system. Justice in Rome was meant to be seen, and the most visible bodies were the ones with the least power. A final roar. So when we hear of beasts in the arena, of sacks sown with snakes and dogs, of men dying beneath claws and fangs, we are not hearing random cruelty. We are hearing the theater of power, the choreography of fear. Rome did not punish to forget. Rome punished to remind that beneath the marble and law, there was always another Rome, one made of fur and fang and fire, where guilt was judged not only by a court, but by a lion's roar.